So I'm calling this an in-class problem, but technically it's not in class. It is one that I cover in my in-person classes, but I think it's perfect for our online class as well. So in talking about activity-based costing, I'm going to use this example here for PowerCat Corp to talk about some different ways to think about the difference between traditional overhead application, which is one driver, versus activity-based costing, which is the application of overhead with multiple drivers. So as we look at this, there are some questions at the bottom here. It says question 1, if traditional based costing is used, what is the predetermined overhead rate based on direct labor hours? So that part's just going to be practice from what we've already been doing. And then we're going to look at the activity-based costing overhead rates for each activity. And we're actually going to go a step further and go ahead and apply that in question 2. Now, question 3 is just going to discuss how manufacturing overhead will be applied based on these traditional based costing or activity-based costing factors. And I'm just going to answer those first. And since I have this in Excel, I'm going to type into this instead of write. So hopefully my visualization in that presentation will be a little bit better. So remember, traditional based costing, if we're applying overhead to our jobs based on traditional based costing, there is one driver of manufacturing overhead. And that one driver gets applied to the actual activity that happened. Okay, now when we move into activity-based costing, guess what? It's the exact same thing, except for there are multiple drivers of manufacturing overhead. Each driver rate is applied to the actual activity, and then total manufacturing overhead applied is the sum of each of those. Okay, so that's the difference between traditional based costing and activity based costing. Remember, the whole idea is that traditional based costing assumes that labor or machine hours is driving the cost of overhead. Activity based costing says, well, wait a minute, we think that there's more. There's more than just one driver. Okay, so this example is going to walk us through that. So first of all, remember, calculating the predetermined overhead rate, we have to know what our estimated overhead is and what our estimated activity, what's driving that activity. What is that? Okay, so this problem has been set up in this table to show you multiple activity cost pools in Chapter 17. However, if we were looking at traditional based costing, remember, we're going to take the actual from Chapter 15, the estimated manufacturing overhead divided by the estimated activity. So if we do it based off of direct labor hours, I actually first need to do a quick sum of my overhead, because these are activity cost pools, which we'll get to in a minute for activity-based costing. But here's the total. So we're going to take this number and we're going to divide that by, if you look up here, direct labor hours are estimated at 100,000 per year. So 100,000 direct labor hours. So our rate is 3.417 million divided by 100,000 hours. Means that our rate is $34.17 per hour. Okay, and if we were going to apply traditional based costing to this problem, we would need to know how many direct labor hours were used in our job. Okay, now we don't have that information. We're just talking about what would happen. Okay, so we'd apply that to the actual activity. If it was, 2,000 hours, whatever it might be, we'd take that times the 34.17 per hour. So how is activity-based costing different? Well, activity-based costing is different because it says, well, wait a second. Of this 3.417 million, each of these estimated overhead costs are driven by a different driver as a result of a different activity. So for example, we have determined for PowerCat Corp that ordering and receiving as an activity has its own cost pool. And the costs associated with ordering and receiving that are overhead are $120,000. Now, what drives that cost for a job is the number of orders. And we expect to have 500 orders throughout our period of time, which is probably an annual amount of time, so 12 months, okay? Now, how do we calculate the rate? It's the same way as we did under the traditional method. So if you bear with me here while I do the calculation, I'm going to take my $120,000 of estimated overhead for this activity, divided by my activity cost driver that we estimate for number of orders, and that's my rate. So under the activity-based costing, which is here, what we're saying is that for every order we have, we're going to apply first $240 of overhead. Now we need to do the same thing for each one of these because machine setups has its own costs associated with it that are all overhead. And if we expect the number of setups to be the driver of that cost, we need to divide. So again, same calculation, that didn't change. It's just that for each one of these, we're going to have an individual driver that drives our activity. And that activity drives our cost. So I'm just filling in these calculations. Again, they're all the same. I could have copied the formula down, okay? But these are my individual activity cost driver rates. So what I need to do is for my particular job is I want to figure out how many orders, how many setups, how many machining hours, how many parts, and how many inspections. And then I apply that overhead per driver. So I'm going to take my annual activity, or sorry, my actual activity. So for Win All Day, it's one order times my rate. Pretty easy. Now here we have 2 setups as part of this order. I have 5 machining hours as part of this order, 5,000 parts as part of this order, and 1 inspection. So individually, I need to make sure I add these up because that would be my total overhead applied. So that is my answer to number 2, calculating the activity-based costing overhead rate for each activity. We've done that here. And here we've gone ahead and applied that. And so the biggest thing to remember for Chapter 17 in activity-based costing is that now we have moved on from just one driver, which is either labor focused based on a job costing system, or if we're looking at process costing, which we haven't focused a lot on in this class at all, that driver would be machine hours, okay? Activity-based costing basically tells us that no, we have more than one driver, we have more data available. Let's see if we can refine our costing so we can get better at identifying and ultimately controlling the costs for each of these activity cost pools. And that's the foundation of activity-based costing.